there is a lot of questions that, and hopefully in those videos I show you, they will make reference to some of those things because they have to make some assumptions on a few things. The data can only be interpreted from with certain types of assumptions on our part. But these are questions that evolutionary biologists are still trying to figure out and still trying to answer. Excuse me, guys. Does evolution occur very slowly, methodically in one direction? Is it steady? Or does it take these quick jumps over time? We'll talk about pace of evolution here in the next slide. Why are some clades very diverse and some very sparse? To me, that's fascinating. Do we produce new structures, complex structures, or we just simply have a tiny little adaptation to something that's already there? And what's the process that generates these things? And unfortunately, I can't get that video to turn up right, turn out right, as I try to record it on my phone and hook it up my phone to YouTube. I can't do it, so it's kind of a pain in the butt. But the process that does this is looking at the genome and looking at the vast amount of information that doesn't necessarily code for something. They're finding out that it actually does code for something. And they call them switches. Some of this genetic material doesn't do anything, but something changes and it becomes activated. And it causes a different trait to form. The loss of limbs, the ability to generate these limbs. Okay. All of that happened because of a random switch got turned on. And now within that species, that switch stays on. Okay. Because now we have a change in genetic material. We have a change in genetics. And that's going to create some potential changes and some isolation that's going to ultimately form there. So that first question there, does it occur steady or does it occur in very quick jumps? Very difficult to answer because we have to look at the entire fossil record. Okay. You expect to see if an animal dies, you expect to see the fossils, right? Certain types of animals like to exist only in a certain type of habitat. So by that deduction, you can assume that, in this region here, you can find adaptations of various different forms of mammoths, bison, whatever. So you should be able to see if there is a gradual or a burst of change that occurs just by understanding biogeography. Again, over billions of years, sometimes that's still really difficult to see. If evolution is very slow and steady, you expect to see a gradual change from a land-based animal to one that is more based to both land and water, to one that starts to adapt slowly more to the water, to one that has absolutely only water, where you get the change of a tail over time to now where it helps with propulsion more. Walking on land, hell yeah, I need 4 appendages. Okay. Some walking, some crawling. Now this thing is reduced to just basically maybe scooching around on land. If it's scooching around on land, I'm using technical terms here, guys, but that's not going to be able to get around very fast, very prone to be caught, right? So here, that's not really advantageous for a heck of a lot of walking, moving around quick on the land. So now I'm going to stay primarily in the water to where this thing will adapt to ultimately get rid of that. And these are changes that take millions of years to occur. But when it's slow and steady like that, you can see evolutionary change that occurs, the similarities between an animal that walks on the ground with all fours to one that's now adapted fully for water. And you can see that gradual movement that occurs there when it's slow and steady. If evolution occurs in very quick jumps, if all of a sudden we get slow and steady is slow and steady, okay? With quick jumps, you can have, boom, a change and then nothing going on. And then all of a sudden another change and then a change. So when you get these quick changes here, okay, when you get these quick changes to occur, with very little transition between them, it can be very difficult to find. It could not have been preserved properly. Even if fossils, where it is there, if there's such a rapid transition that occurs, even though fossils lay down in regular intervals, it may have not been preserved well. So some of the potential transitions that occurred, they weren't kept very well. They weren't preserved very well. And so we don't see them. We see maybe the skull and maybe some other, maybe appendage bones that are associated with the full skeleton that we do have, so we just assume it's with them. So sometimes it's hard to see these adaptations that occur in a very quick amount of time. And shit, we're talking millions of years here, so I get it. Quick is relative, all right? But still, preservation is preservation. And if the skeleton was not preserved well, where most of it was lost, where you lose some of those transitions, and you just see a change, a drastic change from here to here, seeing those quick jumps, those quick changes that occur may be difficult to see. So if it's slow and steady, it's going to be a heck of a lot easier. Why do some species of different animals have a massive number of species, and why do some only give off a very small number of species? So why does this one example here, why does this one have 400 species compared to another one that gives rise to millions? Why? Why is one group of organisms so diverse and another one is not as diverse? Right place, right time. We call it gets referred to as opportunity knocks. Okay, you just happen to be at the right place at the right time. When it comes to, I know this is something that I believe they talk about in one of the videos of that extinction series. They talk about the saber tooth was at the right place at the right time. As soon as the ice sheet started to recede, it was not in the right place at the right time. The environment started to change. And that's what created a very difficult situation for it to be able to get food. Without food, you can't move around as much. If you can't move around, you can't get food, you can't find a mate, you can't pass on your genes. Okay? So for opportunity knocks, it's all about what did the environment present to them at that given time. Was it able to find a number of various different environmental regions where it could that encourage diversification to give a lot of different species there? Okay. Did the environment, provide isolation? Did it provide a release of competition or a change in the type of predator? Again, just being there at the right time is a lot of it. This is that Precambrian burst right here. All right. When it comes to diversity, it is all about right place, right time. And this can occur over a number of years, millions of years. Okay. But what if all the change, what if all the diversification happens in a very short burst of time? Sorry. That is what adaptive radiation is. In adaptive radiation here, we get the emergence of a huge number of different species. Okay. Rapid diversification, very different adaptations occur in a very small period of time. What could potentially cause this rapid burst, if you will? I don't know. Could be an extinction event. Something happened around 70 million years ago, and we had a change. There was a massive change in environment. And over the course of the next 20 million years, we get this boom of different species. All of these guys that are on this little list here in that little Precambrian burst there in that little yellow region right there, they're all adapting to a slightly different environment. Some are in water, some are in land in different locations with different heat, different temperature, different rainfall, different types of plants. And they all had to be able to adapt to all of that varied type of environment. I'll see if I can find the name of that documentary that talks about some different extinction events and how they're trying to figure out if that extinction event in our hemisphere can affect the opposite side of the world. Pretty interesting. And that's what I'm talking about here. Okay, that Precambrian burst, where all of a sudden you get a massive amount of different species in a very short period of time, several different body forms. You can, if you look at the pictures over here, all of those look vastly different from one another. A marsupial looks a hell of a lot different from a rodent, looks a hell of a lot different from a primate, looks a hell of a lot different from an anteater, a horse. I mean, there's a massive amount. Flying squirrel and a bat look different from a rodent. I mean, there's a ton of severely different body forms there that all came about in a very small period of time, relatively speaking. They think the reason for looking for all that massive amount of Different species popping up at that one time. Was an extinction event that occurred, a massive one, being the one that kind of killed off the dinosaurs and whatnot. One of the last concepts here looks at complexity of structures. What would be a complexity of structures? Wings, the eye, a multitude of various different chemical pathways. We have chemical pathways here. We have a chemical pathway to decide whether or not something tastes good or tastes bad. We have a chemical pathway that burns. We have a chemical pathway that can feel really, really cold. We have chemical pathways to induce pain. We have chemical pathways to feel good. There are a number of intricate chemical pathways. Some of them help to maintain pH balance within the body, homeostasis. But we're a pretty complex creature. If we compare that to a bacteria, there are some bacteria that that can sense certain types of chemicals. This is a survival technique. And they will, scooch away from that chemical. And this is an example of something that was very simple in the beginning, getting away from noxious chemicals for a single-celled organism, to being super intricate, super complex in us. So there are a lot of adaptations that have evolved over the course of time. And the greatest example is the sense of sight. It all started very simply and complex with just detecting chemicals. Over the course of time, we start to get the development of not necessarily a very true eyeball, but a very rudimentary eyeball. And we refer to this as an advantageous intermediate step. We have a group of worms called platyhelminthes, or flatworms, and flatworms have eye spots. And if we would have been in the lab, we could have gotten some flatworms and put them on a scope for you, and you could watch this thing undulate around. And it looks like these two creepy eyes are staring back at you. It's not a true eyeball in the sense of what we think of an eye, like our eye. Allows me to see, things moving around. I can see in color. I can see in black and white. A very complex thing. But what good would half an eye be? Can anybody think of a reason why just having some semblance of an eyeball be advantageous? Well, hopefully you can. It's one thing to detect a chemical, but that chemical may not get released until another creature is damn near on top of me. And by then I can't get away from it and I'm sunk. So maybe with a half of eye, I can see shadows. I can see just light and dark, okay, black and white. So I can see something bigger coming closer to me out from my field of view. And that gives me an advantage to where I can get the heck out of Dodge before that big guy gets any closer, before that big creature gets any closer and gets me. That would be a hell of an advantage, greater than having no vision at all. And there's the planaria right there. There's the flatworm with those two creepy eyeballs right there staring back at you. Okay? There they are right there. So again, they don't function like a true eyeball like us, but it's somewhere in between having an eyeball and not having an eyeball. Same thing when it comes to flight as well. Okay. And with planaria, I mean, that's an advantageous intermediate. Okay. Have, not have, or somewhere in between. And that's where that advantageous intermediate, that's where it fits, right in the middle. Okay, it provides some kind of advantage for that species. Co-opting is this whole, convergent evolution thing that we've talked about. The development of wings from a multitude of various different avenues. Well, when co-opting, it doesn't necessarily provide the concept of flight like a true wing, but we have different creatures that don't have feathers but still fly. Why do we have different animals, some that have wings, some that don't? Why do we have wings? And then some of these that have wings have not only wings, but feathers with those wings. Sorry, there we go. The evolution of feathers seen in some of the first types of dinosaurs with wings, these feathers may have had nothing to do with the ability for flight. Hell, it probably had nothing to do with flight, to be honest. But maybe it had to do with that sexual dimorphism that we talked about. Maybe it was for not necessarily attracting a mate, but maybe it was to appear bigger, scarier. What if it was to help with warmth or cooling off? There could be a number of reasons as to why dinosaurs had feathers on them with a wing associated with them. So they co-opted the feathers and wing-like appearance, but the two are not related. Now, over millennia, is it suggested that birds split off from dinosaurs? Yes. And birds are feathered and they fly. So you would assume that feathers equate to all things that fly, and that is not the case. It's referred to as co-opting. The great thing about evolution is that the more stuff we find, the more information, the more data we have. With more data, you get to fill in maybe some voids, but the great thing about that is it opens up new avenues and new questions. So when it comes to this concept of evolution and where we ultimately come from, we only have a glimmer of how and when and the mechanisms for which evolution occurred. And being able to see that on a small scale is something that we can do, especially with bacteria. Getting to see it on a first-hand scale or first-hand knowledge on a macro scale, very difficult to see. Okay. Got to see it on a fossil record. Got to find it. And then have to do scientific method on those fossils to try to figure out what in the hell that meant for that individual creature. And what that means to where does it fit within the grand scheme of things within the tree of life. And what that means for its descendants. Did it have any descendants? These are all fantastic questions. And the great thing about science, you never stop. You never stop looking for answers. You never stop finding answers and having end of story. it constantly evolves.